And for a lot of people, that's a very scary thought that that would happen to us. But when there's all these things that connect up, like children with past life memories and near-death experiences, and mediumship, and then there's deathbed visions, and there's past life regression, and there's something called shared death experiences and terminal lucidity, and all these different things.
Well, hey, Simon, welcome back to Generation X Paranormal.
It's great to be here. I'm glad I can talk to you guys again.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah, for
we've been
sure.
looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's funny. We've had so many different guests, and I think Nicole and I have both mutually agreed that for some reason the sound of your voice is so soothing and relaxing that we like, oh, we're gonna get to talk to Simon today. I'm like, oh, it'll be a nice, nice little
You
relaxing.
should put out one of those
sit-down.
meditation,
Yeah. should be-
tapes or something.
You should be on the call map,
Yeah.
really, because it's pretty impressive. But yeah, last time you were on, we talked about past life regression, and obviously it's a very interesting subject. We've covered that pretty well, and the book that we're about to talk about that you've got coming out is a bit near and dear to my heart for a lot of different reasons. And I think we might have even talked about it on the last time you were on. But kind of before we get into all that, and since you have been on, it can be really brief, but kind of give our audience kind of a really quick, short bio, if you will, kind of what got you here.
Okay, I got a diploma in clinical hypnotherapy in 2016, and I'm certified in past life regression therapy. And I started podcasting 2018, and I've got two podcasts now, the Our Paranormal Afterlife and Alien UFO podcast. And with those two combined, I've now released over 800 episodes. Wow. And I've had all sorts of experiences myself over the decades that are paranormal and just weird. And so it's been like when I was 10 years old, I would be taking books out the local public library about all sorts of supernatural things. But it kind of came down to these two things of afterlife and UFOs. And it's weird because it's getting to a point now where people are seeing there's a connection between those two things.
Yep.
But in my podcast, Our Paranormal Afterlife, I'm looking for evidence of an afterlife because I'm not religious. I never have been. And so it's a kind of thing, if somebody says, oh, I got some evidence there's an afterlife, I'm like, okay, prove it. Where is the evidence? What is it?
Right.
And
that's definitely true.
I was going to say I could talk about it for hours, but then I have done 800 episodes.
Right. And you're right.
So there have been
hours.
hours. Yeah.
Yeah. When it comes to the afterlife, I find that you have to take into account so many different things. You have to take into account, obviously, religious beliefs and things of that nature. So it can get a little bit tricky when you're trying to kind of delve into it and get kind of the real nuts and bolts of everything behind it. And then sometimes you got to bring in the scientific part of it too to see kind of how it all washes together. And I think it's probably a very personal and different experience for each individual too. I would think there's not a one size fits all. You know what I mean? It would be almost impossible. While I would imagine there's going to be some similarities, I would imagine there's got to be some very unique things that each person that's had one of these has had. So kind of getting started. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the book. So like I said, Nicole's had a chance to read it, and I'm going to get there, I promise. We just haven't had a chance to with work. But verified near-death experiences, proof of an afterlife. What, aside from the numerous amount of content that you've created behind it, what made you decide to write a book about it?
I feel like I've been doing the podcast because I come across this amazing information for years. I've been reading books and I think this is amazing. And I felt like more people should know about it because it's a thing that can indicate that when we die, we're not just completely annihilated, that our consciousness continues. And for a lot of people, that's a very scary thought that would happen to us. But when there's all these things that connect up, like children with past life memories and near-death experiences and, mediumship, and then there's deathbed visions and there's past life regression and there's something called shared death experiences and terminal lucidity, and, all these different things, and they all kind of are parts of this puzzle. And it's a thing, we don't have all the parts of the puzzle, but we've got some of them. And you can see how they all link up and they make sense of each other. And it all does really point towards consciousness surviving death and that your brain is not the source of consciousness. And I talked to a guy recently on my podcast called Dr. Robert Davis. Mm-hmm. He's retired now, but for 30 years he was professor of neuroscience at New York University, or the University of New York.
Right,
I don't know which way around.
Yeah.
But so I read his book, and there's some weird brain stuff that he talks about where there's something called hydrocephalus, which is when there's an enormous amount of liquid build up in the skull, and it can be when the baby's in the womb, and the brain matter is pushed right up, so it's just a lining of the skull. And there are people who are completely, you would have no idea that is what happened to them, but it's later on you find out this straight A student, who may be great in college, and he has some reason to have a scan on his brain, and they find virtually doesn't have one. And then there was another woman who she needed surgery, and it affected the whole left side of her brain. I think it was her left side, and it was completely gone. So she only had the right side of her brain, but it didn't affect her personality as she was as a person. She was still there. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like that the brain is a processing unit or something that they're like a receiver, like a radio. And if the radio breaks, doesn't mean the radio station stops transmitting. So I've had great interest in all of this, and so I came round to write a book about it because I had all that information and I knew there was more detail there. And this book about verified near-death experiences, they're called veridical, which is it's in my book. Veridical comes from the Latin word veridicus, to mean the truth. And with veridical ones, I only know of one other book about veridical near-death experiences. All the other books that I've ever found and all the stuff I've done with the podcast, they mention it, but they don't really study it and make it the function of the book, the focus of the book. So I thought that's what I want to do. I want to get this out to people. So that's what the book's about. It's these incidences when somebody has a near-death experience and they have that out-of-body experience and they're looking down on their body and they'll see something happen while they're dead. And because it may be in an operating theatre, the brain is hooked up to a machine, the heart is, so they can see the heart stop beating, the brain is flatlined. And then the person will recount to the team what happened during the resuscitation. And the medical team can say, but you can't have seen that. We know your brain was flatlined when that happened. And they said, no, I was at the ceiling, I was watching it. But in my book, there's about 30 near-death experiences. And there's all sorts of verifications in there. So that was in the operating theatre. But I've got one with a guy that was in an apartment 7 kilometres away and was very accurate about what happened while he was in hospital having CPR. So there's all sorts of things in this book. And it's that verification. They see something that happened while they're dead. And Dr. Eben Alexander was on my podcast. He was professor of neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School. He told me that when your heart stops, your brain will flatline within about 20 seconds, and it's impossible for your brain to make and retain complex memories while it's in that state. And yet that is what these people do. And they see it from a perspective of outside the body.
Wow.
Yeah. I think I know which story you're talking about where they traveled to the apartment. It was the one where I think it was the nurse's family that he
Yeah.
visited the apartment and he was able to tell like the husband's socks, what was on his socks. It was crazy.
Oh, that's odd.
I was like, yeah. It was fascinating. Fascinating story.
You know, when it comes to death, you know, unfortunately, it's something we're all gonna do. There's no escape from it. It is at the end for all of us. And as I find myself getting a little bit in a golf term, on the back nine of this mortal coil, you know, I realize that it is something that I have to entertain. I know it's there, and there's a lot of fear behind it. Did you find that kind of, obviously you've got a lot of content in it, and not knowing how you particularly feel about it, but did you find that with these experiencers, did they have a completely new outlook on, you know, sort of what kind of is there at the end for all of us?
Yeah, it's a thing that just about all near-death experiencers say, is they have no fear of death at all. They know that when you die, losing your body is just like taking an overcoat off, and it's just a transition to another form of existence. And often they get into that state and they'll say that this is just one of your lives and that this is an existence. You know, this life is gone, but then I know about all the others now, and I know that I'll have more lives to come. And there's pretty much a universal message from people who have near-death experience who say there's nothing to fear in death. It's just a transition.
That is very comforting. You
Yeah,
know,
it is. That's what I've always heard from most of the people that, well, we've had, one near-death experiencer and one shared death experiencer on our podcast as well, and they both said the same thing.
Yeah, shared death is
Shared death is
blows me away. But
it was the first time I'd ever heard of that
I'd
experience.
never heard of that before. But I would imagine it's so cathartic to have something like that happen, you know. And I don't know if we covered this the last time we spoke, and I think we did. But and our audience is pretty well knows about this. But I had a brain bleed. Oh gosh, what is it now? A couple of years now.
2 to 3 years.
Yeah, about 2 or 3 years ago. And for me, it absolutely was like a light switch. Bang, I was gone. But it's hard for me to kind of correlate with some of this, because for me it was just complete. It was a void, and I never got any experience at all. So whenever I talk with someone, or I guess sit down and try to have a rational conversation, I always try to figure out what it was that I got to experience. Now, I'm not saying it was near death, because I don't know. But what I know happened is I got this brain bleed, I shut down, completely went out, and to explain to somebody that there was a void, it's not even what a void is. It is absolutely non-existence. And that has been really the hardest thing for me to digest about that entire experience. So, but it was fast. It was so fast that, you know, my eyes were still open. You know, people who came, you know, to help me, my eyes were still open. It had happened that fast. So I always wonder, knowing that consciousness and not knowing where consciousness lives, it's always been one of those things to rationalize, because my brain, for all intents and purposes, was shut down. Was it flatline? Probably not, because I would imagine my heart would have stopped and all those sort of things. But, you know, when I came to, you know, granted, it took an entire year for me to recover from that, and then some. But yeah, I guess I'm always really looking for an answer of where that consciousness lives. And with what you've written, nobody knows for sure, but have you got some thoughts kind of where our genesis comes from? Because I'm with you. I don't believe that your consciousness resides in your brain, because I had that brain bleed, and it affected such a large portion of it that I know everything kind of remapped. You know, it's very dynamic. Things kind of went back around. You know, you always think that in the brain you've got one spot that controls this, and if that gets damaged, it never works again. Now, while there's some truth behind that, there's also kind of a misnomer behind that, because it will, if it's capable, kind of remap some of that. And we've had brain surgeons, we had a brain surgeon on, and, you know, we kind of talked about that. But yeah, I guess my long diatribe goes to where do you believe, or where do some of your experiences believe, kind of where their consciousness lies?
Well, they seem to suggest that what we experience of the world, of the universe, is such a tiny fraction of what's actually there, and that where is our consciousness? It's right here. It's all around us. And they talk about this amazing connection when they're in that space where they may meet up with all these other spirits or souls, and they're all connected and they know each other absolutely, and that it's everywhere. You know, I suppose it's like the thing the Bible will say, God is everywhere. It's like this afterlife is everywhere. But what you're talking about with your experience is, one of the things about near-death experiences is only like 12-15% of people who have a near-death sort of physical episode remember having an experience of being outside the body and all that spiritual stuff. Most people don't have a near-death experience when they have a heart attack or something. And I've wondered why that is. And I know one researcher, one researcher who thinks it's that everybody has it, but not everybody remembers. And there's another feeling that a near-death experience is a real spiritually transformative experience, and the spirit world might be watching you and seeing how you're living your life and thinking, you know what, we need to have a word with them. And when they have the near-death experience, they go, quick, grab him, he's dead, we can talk to him now.
Wow,
But
That's a good point, yeah.
I have had, as a hypnotherapist, a couple of people who've asked me to regress them to that point where they had some kind of episode of a heart attack or something, to see if they had a near-death experience. And little things have come up in the hypnosis, little memories. And there's other times people have a near-death experience and they're with what you might call their spirit guides. And those might say to them something like, we're not going to let you remember this experience, the whole of it. We're just going to let you remember enough so that you realised it happened and you believed in it. So it's as though the spirit world can take away the whole memory of it if they need to. And that maybe that's something that happened to you.
That is fascinating. I will say, since that happened, I have changed quite a bit. Honestly, that was kind of the genesis of our show. Really, it kind of started with that because we both, even though she didn't have the experience, well, she had the experience, just in a different way, but
still traumatic.
Still traumatic, and we've been searching for answers for a lot of different things. But no, that makes sense. I'd be interested to find out if I did in fact have one, because I do feel like my consciousness and what I do and what I value completely skewed after that. So it is something that I may have to hit you up on, which I'm absolutely. In fact, we literally just talked about this the other day. If we were to ever do one of those, we're calling you. We're not doing it with anybody else because we know you, we trust you at this point. But
oh, great! Plus, I got a soothing voice, so
yeah. I'm telling you, man, it's amazing. You know, I love all our guests. They're all absolutely cherished, but there are some select few that when you speak to them, there's an ebb and flow. And I mean, I'm not going to say you have a podcaster's voice because there's so many podcasters out there. Who the heck knows what that really means? But you know, it's very soothing. So anyway, I could probably go on for hours about that. But okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the stories. Now, I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage because I know Nicole's read half and you wrote it. But what were the ones, and I'm sure each one of them has a very special meaning or you wouldn't have taken the time to write about it. But what would be one of the cornerstone stories that went, okay, this is something that either A, you hadn't expected, or B, that would really be shocking that a lot of people wouldn't quite wrap their heads around?
Well, there's so much in the book. I mean, there's this guy, Randy Schaefer, who had his near-death experience. He was in a coma when he had COVID, and he had a 3% chance of surviving. And he had 4 different episodes of a near-death experience during that. But the thing that was really great of the verification, this type of verification, was that towards the end of his last experience, this man appeared who he didn't know who it was. And he kept on saying, "Tell Madison at the salon I'm okay." And then he kept on hearing the word veteran in his mind. And he saw this man on a white porch, and he had all these flags, and he was making up red, white and blue ribbons and things. And when he came out of the coma and eventually got home and he needed a haircut, he was looking for a card for a hair salon, and he found one, gave it to his daughter and said, "Can you book me in?" And she came back and said, "This is Madison." So they booked the haircut, and he went, and while he was sitting in the chair having a haircut, he explained to her that, "I saw this guy who said, 'Tell Madison at the salon.'" And he describes the man to her, and she said, that's my grandfather. He died about a year ago." And so Randy said, "Did he live in this town?" Because he was worried that he'd seen him somewhere, and that was where he got the image from. But she said, no, he lived in Idaho. They were in Florida, and he'd never been to Florida. So he started saying, well, he said that there was the white porch, and he saw him making up these ribbons, and he had these flags and the word veteran. And she said, yes, he would sit on his white porch and make that stuff up because he was a veteran, and they'd have Veterans Day, and he took a big part in that. And so he got this guy John, he was the guy that died, the grandmother's phone number, and called her up in Idaho and said, "Look, her name was Kathy." He said, this is what happened, and this is what I saw. And she sent him a photograph, and that was it. That was exactly the guy that he had seen during the near-death experience. And so that was a real strong confirmation. And he eventually went to visit, and he stood on that white porch. It was exactly as he'd seen it during the near-death experience. And so Kathy said to him, this isn't the first time John's tried to make contact. Then it's weird with business cards, because she found a business card in his drawer that was for an insurance company, and she thought maybe he had some life insurance. So she called the number, and the guy answered, and he said, "No, I have nothing to do with insurance." And he said, "What number did you dial?" And she said, "I dialed this number." And he said, "Oh, you got the area code wrong. I'm in California." And he said, "Who are you?" And he said, "Well, I'm Kathy, and I'm in Idaho." And he goes, "Hang on, you're Kathy in Idaho?" I had an accident on a motorbike a couple of weeks ago, and it was really bad. And while I was lying on the tarmac and I nearly died, I heard somebody shouting at me, "Tell Kathy in Idaho I'm okay." Just shouting it over and over. And he'd had his motorcycle crash out in the countryside, not in a town or something. When the ambulance was there, he asked them who was there. And the ambulance said, "There was no one there, you were all by yourself." So there's a couple of funny little verifications there that this guy he saw during the near-death experience, and how he's found another way to communicate. And it's also that connection with Kathy and the insurance guy, the string of events that would have to come together, that she would have to misdial his number, and it would happen to be in, and they would have that conversation. And so how would John know 2 weeks in advance that he would make a misdialed phone call to this guy? It's almost like, the guy and the dead guy knew the future. He knew what was going to happen. God, or maybe John interfered with the phone call, and when she dialed, he messed up the dial on purpose from his side, somehow electronically. Right. Just don't know, but I love that story.
That is amazing.
I hadn't got to that one. Yeah, that's
first of all, it's so leveled and layered. Mm-hmm. It's so much more than just
determined. Very determined to pass on his message. Yeah,
that's for sure. But
wow.
You hear about some of these, and it's just, and they're all valid. There's nothing wrong with it. But this one in particular has got so much. Like I said, it's just very layered. So it's interesting. I would imagine that's probably one of the ones that I would agree with you. That is one of those where, okay, you could have easily pawned off maybe one of those. I don't know about easily, but maybe one of those events you could have maybe talked yourself out of or rationalized it in some way, shape, or form to say, okay, well, maybe it's just very coincidental, or, there may be some other explanation behind it. But when you put it all together and you look at it from that holistic view, I mean, just wow, what an amazing accounting.
And he had quite a set of experiences with what you might call the spirit world, and things that happened that were quite strange. And there was a point where in his first part of his near-death experience, he found himself in this incredible hall that was so big and so tall and so beautiful. And this guy was standing next to him who said, "You like this place?" And he goes, "Yeah, I love this place." And the guy said, "This is called the Welcoming Hall. This is where people come to." And they were talking about it. And then the guy said to him, "You're not supposed to be here. You've got to leave." And so he had to leave the hall, and he went out through these big wooden doors, and he was in this amazing city, which he said was beyond anything on earth, with the skyscrapers so tall, and it was so beautiful. And he felt kind of lost. He didn't know where to go, and they saw this stairway going up into the sky, like a stairway to heaven. And he started going up these stairs, and then he heard a voice behind him shout, "Look, there's George, grab him." Or there's Randy, grab him. And so he felt this pull on his collar, and then he went back into the coma, and he was completely unconscious. It just seems weird that would happen in the spirit world.
I know.
There he is.
Yeah.
We lost him.
Yeah.
That's so amazing. I know there were a few stories that I had read, and I thought it was so interesting, talking about, most of them I think were in the hospital, and they were, flatlining or whatever the case was at the time. And they were trying to look at something, like they were up on the ceiling and they wanted a closer look. And they said that they felt like they vibrated and changed their frequency. And then they were like right on top of it and were able to see things clearly. And there were a few stories like that. And I thought that was super interesting, because we've talked to a few people talking about even like time travel. They think that, if we ever were able to do something like that, it would have to be in the mind, and it would have to do with changing your frequency. So I thought that was super interesting.
Yeah, that's the weird thing, isn't it? It's that the first chapter, the lady who's on that bed, and she dies while she's in this procedure in the hospital, and they're putting the dye into her spine to see where the dye leaks out of her spine because of this injury, but they tip the table the wrong way, and the dye goes into her brain and kills her.
Yeah.
And when she's up at the ceiling, she sees this box they quickly set up, and it's measuring her heart rate, I think, and it's flatlined. And she wanted to look at it, and then suddenly she said it's like she's that close to it, and she could see it in perfect detail. And when she had enough information, then suddenly she was back on the ceiling again. And there's a couple like that in the book, isn't there?
Yeah. I thought it was just like, I just was like, whoa, because we had heard and talked about this multiple times about vibrating and changing your frequency and being able to travel from different dimensions and different time, and for that to happen in like an NDE, an afterlife type space, I mean, it just verified like what everybody's already guessing as to what could happen.
Yeah, it's the Hungarian guy that talks about that. And when he was in the hospital, and he went into the nurse's room next door to the ward, and there was a nurse taking all those bits out of the cupboard and putting them on the trolley, and she dropped one that went under the cabinet, and he wanted to get a look at it, and it's that again, there's that thing, it's 4 inches away from him. Yeah. And he memorised the serial number on there and what was written on it, and later he told the doctor about the serial number and everything, and that he was completely correct about this thing that was under a cabinet in a room that he's supposedly never been in.
Right, yeah, the doctor went and checked underneath
so
and found it. Yeah. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, and it kind of makes me think about, we talk about skeptics, and granted, our audience, there are plenty of them, as I'm sure probably with your audience as well. And I think that I'm kind of a bit more on the skeptic side for a lot of different things. And, you kind of mentioned that you're sort of in the same boat, but what do you hope that skeptics get out of this book? That I guess, because I think what eventually happens especially when you study the paranormal in any way, shape, or form, you start to notice that your proficiencies for reality start to dwindle down a little bit because there's a lot of stuff that just becomes ultra questionable. But, for those of us who are a little bit more skeptical, what do you kind of hope they get out of this?
Well, maybe a path forwards, a step forwards on a spiritual path. If they're interested in it, it's good to be skeptical, but I'll still be open-minded and not just completely shut down anything. It's like in the first story in the book, the woman's telling the neurosurgeon about what happened. After she's woken up from her near-death experience, and he's standing next to her. And she said he clenched his fists and he clenched his teeth, and he goes, "I'm not going to stand here and listen to any more of this." And he stormed out of the room. And that's a real closed-minded skeptic kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's got so many different bits of verification in here. People couldn't possibly have known these things under any normal circumstances. And there is a skeptical point of view to say, well, if they were in the operating theatre watching what happened while they were being resuscitated, maybe they did have some kind of consciousness, and that's how come they knew what happened. Mm-hmm. But, there's one of the guys who points out that man's socks in the apartment 7 kilometres away. And then I've got people who are down the hallway in the hospital in the waiting room who know what happened in that waiting room, or they know what happened on the other side of town. And there's a guy... He's in hospital after this car crash, and his mum calls his uncle, and his uncle was driving his car on the way to California, taking his family on holiday, and he said to the family, "We've got to turn around and go back because Malcolm's in the hospital." And the kids in the back were saying, "Oh, we don't care about Malcolm, let's go to California." And it's like, but Malcolm was able to talk to them later and describe everything that happened in the car. That was miles away on a highway, and they just couldn't explain, how did he know that? And he said that he could be in both places at once. He could be with his mum while she was on the phone, and he could be in the car, and that he could hear their thoughts as well as what they were saying. And it's that kind of spiritual connection that we were talking about, and things that near-death experiencers say, you just can't describe actually what their experience is. It's because it's so different to what we experience.
Sure. Right. Yeah, that splitting, just, I cannot figure it out. How they're able to. And I think when we talked about the shared death experience, it was kind of like that. He felt like, I think the other person that he had the shared death experience with was able to be in two places at once. The woman that had passed or was in the coma was able to be with one other person and him at the same time, and two people were having a shared death experience at the same time with the woman, but they weren't all together in three. They were separated, and that just kind of blew my mind how that could even happen.
Yeah. And you get a lot of this too. Again, skeptics. There have been several times in my life, and I know other stories exist, and I'm sure, Simon, you've had plenty of these, and you've probably talked to a lot of people that have had them, where, there's always that old age story about the mother was in another city, her hand was hurting, she picked up the phone, called her daughter, found out that she had burnt her hand on a stove. There's that sort of
connection.
Right, the connection. And then even for myself, honestly, I think this just happened this week. I told Nicole, I said, "Hey, your phone's ringing." And she said, "No, it's not." And then it started ringing. Hadn't rung yet.
Yeah, that was kind of weird.
It was a little bit spooky. I can't explain that, but it's like being able to get that frequency and that vibration maybe ahead of time. So, there's always some of that exists even on our plane right now where we're at. So it's
just amplified. Maybe.
Right. It's just amplified. So, Simon, with the doctors and with the healthcare professionals, again, I don't knock anything that they say, but they've always got to be on a very scientific kind of...
Yeah, but you would think they'd be the ones experiencing this the most, hearing the most about it, because they're right there when these patients wake up.
And I'm curious to how many actually do, but just don't say
talk
anything,
about it, yeah.
Because it's on a kind of a career path they don't want to go down. But have you spoken to them? Have they been part of any of your research and kind of What are they saying about it?
Well, I haven't talked to any real skeptics, and I've talked to doctors who have experienced something and it's completely changed their point of view. In the book, there's Jeff Olson and Jeff O'Driscoll. Jeff Olson was in this terrible car crash, and it was his fault, he thinks, and his wife and one of his children died in the crash. And when he got to hospital, he's in the trauma unit, and he saw her spirit come to him and tell him not to worry and say something like everything is as it should be. But at the same time, Jeff O'Driscoll, the doctor, and one of the nurses, they saw her as well. So that's kind of like a shared death experience.
Yeah,
And a verification that she was there, and she communicated with Dr. O'Driscoll as well. So, that changed their viewpoint. Dr. Eben Alexander was a complete materialist until he had his near-death experience. And there's Dr. Penny Sartori, but she was a nurse. I think it was 17 years she worked in the ICU before she moved on, and now she's a doctor. And she saw all sorts of things, and people would tell her about near-death experiences because she had just resuscitated them. And so that's how she got into it. And I don't think she particularly had an interest at the time. And I remember she said that her first night as working as a nurse, she worked in a hospice, and she was arrived there, and they have a briefing before they start the shift, and the lady in charge was saying patient in room 17 is talking to people that aren't there, so we expect them to pass away in the next couple of days. And Penny Sartori was like, they're playing a trick. I'm the new girl. It's play a prank on the new girl. Mm-hmm. But she went in there, and there was this person having a conversation with somebody who wasn't there, and it was the deathbed vision, which so many people have, and so many hospice nurses see. But I think the point about having doctors who are very skeptical, I think it's the nurses that see most of this stuff, because they're the ones that are really there most of the time looking after the patients, and the doctors will only come in when they're needed.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And I think there are a couple of good books out written by hospice nurses talking about all their sorts of experiences they've seen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, you see those on, if you're doing a doom scroll on one of the social sites, you always see, and then there's a very, very popular nurse that's on those where they know as a hospice nurse that as they're on their deathbed, you see people reaching up. There's a very well-known documented phenomenon that happens when someone's about to pass, because they're sort of reaching out and seeing something. And it's one of those where it's a consistency. You see it a lot. Mm-hmm. And, of course, people can write that off as, neurons firing or whatever you want to say, but...
Well, that's the scientific explanation.
Right.
Yeah.
But if that many people are having it, I don't know. It's... I don't know. I do believe in Occam's razor, but I also believe that there's a lot more kind of involved with that. And kind of with that, what have you found are some of the similarities that are a bit more astounding? Now, again, we kind of talked about it. Each one of them's got to have somewhat of a completely individualized experience, but there's got to be some similarities, similar to like what I just talked about. Is that kind of something that you found a little bit?
Yeah, with near-death experiences, there seems to be a place that you might call an idealised version of Earth. And I think 3 or 4 of the people in the book talk about going to this incredible building that is so big and looks so amazing. It's got big Greek Roman columns at the front and huge stairs leading up to it. And it's like a university. And there's all these people coming and going, and all these different people in the book are saying like they go up the stairs and they enter, and there's bookshelves up to the ceiling, and all these people at tables examining and reading stuff. And so that's a consistency that's shown up, that people seem to be describing the same building. And there's the life review, which shows up a lot in the book, where people see their whole life all over again, but they experience it from other people's point of view. They feel the emotions, and it can be a very harrowing experience for some people. But that's a real learning experience, And I think that's one of the things that really changes people who have a near-death experience, because they come back and they treat people differently, and they realise the slightest little thing has such a ripple effect and goes out and can affect so much. Because there's a guy in the book, George Ritchie, and his experience was 1941, I think, or 42. And he was at a camp in training before he was going to fight in Europe, and he was in the army. And he had terrible pneumonia, and he had this near-death experience. And he met this incredible spiritual being, which he interpreted as being Jesus. And Jesus will ask him these questions, and one of them was, what have you achieved in life? And he was just a young man, you know, and he thought, I was Eagle Scout, and he's quite proud of himself. Yeah. But then the spiritual being of Jesus said to him, no, what have you achieved? And it was then he realised it was about who have you loved, and how much have you loved them, and how many times have you done anything to be kind to people. And that's what it was all about. And it's not about some massive achievement you've done to help people. It could just be the slightest little thing where you make somebody feel a bit happier. And that's what's important. And I see that showing up in different near-death experiences. That idea, you know, of it's all about caring for other people. And there was one guy, he was asked 3 questions about, like, could you look a fellow human in the eye and say you've been a good man? And he had to answer no. And there were 3 questions like that, and he had to answer no to all 3 of them. And that was a real shock for him, really pointed out to him how he'd been living his life and how much he needed to change. And so he had a weird life review as well. And people get these life reviews and they seem to manifest in all sorts of different ways. But basically it's the same experience.
So, yeah, I read a few of those, and I think there was one, and it was a woman, I cannot remember her name, talked about, I don't think they were going to send her back, but she's like, no, I need to go back. And they're like, how are you going to behave, and what is your life's purpose going to be? And she had to come up with that, and that was her way back, basically. Like, she had to be different and do something different to get back.
That's wild. Yeah, first of all, when you said it, the building with a lot of columns, for some reason I thought of Led Zeppelin Houses of the Holy, but which
I just like that there's books. There's like a library. That would make me happy.
Yeah, so those of you who don't read and just want to look at iPads, this is what you got coming to you. But no, that's so fascinating. What's interesting is that I've actually seen some of this. Like, we've had movies where they've kind of touched on this a little bit. I think one was like, I know Albert Brooks was in it with Meryl Streep. I think it was called like Defending Your Life or something like that. Yeah, and this has somewhat been explored before. So that's interesting that there's that continuity. It is one of those.
There's a David Niven film called A Matter of Life and Death. Have you seen that one?
I have not seen it, but yes, I do absolutely know about that movie.
Yeah, when he was a pilot in the Second World War and he gets shot down and the spirit world missed him, and so he carries on living, and then they send this 17th century Frenchman who's quite a dandy to go and collect him, but the pilot's saying, no, I don't want to go. And eventually it ends up in kind of some kind of spiritual courtroom where he has to have a lawyer defending him, and then the prosecution's trying to make it that, no, you've got to come to heaven. He's like, I don't want to go to heaven yet.
It's true.
That's cool.
It's so interesting. You know, you see these things and you always go, well, you know, it's just fanciful thinking. And, you know, for by and large, a lot of it is. But then you get it down to some of these experiences and you're like, okay, some of these people that have written this stuff, you got to wonder, what did they know that we didn't at that time, you know?
Yeah. Well, this has been happening forever. It's just, I think we've, you know, basically buried our head in the sand and worry about working our job and, you know, get all, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of it out there.
Saying?
Yeah, I do. I think that we've
walked away from the spiritual path, basically.
Right. Yeah. And we spoke with a guy, and I don't know if you know, familiar with him, but his name's Peter Panagore, and he had kind of told us a few of the things that
he died what, 3
Yeah,
times?
I think 3 times.
3 separate times,
Yeah.
and had NDEs every single time.
Yeah.
It's pretty fascinating.
It's fascinating. Now, have you had a
Yeah.
chance to speak with him?
I have, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was a while ago. And sometimes people ask me about episode here or episode there, and I'm like, oh man, I've done 800. I'm not sure I can remember exactly.
That's hard to remember.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're getting to that point too where we're like, sure. Yeah, I remember talking about that.
Yeah, he actually spoke about being shown his life and having to feel like the bad things that he did to other people or how he hurt someone. And he said it felt like it was like over 100,000 times harder on him than what he actually did to the person. Like, and he interpreted it as like maybe that's what hell is in the Bible, is that you're having to feel the pain that you inflicted on someone else. And that's actually the interpretation. And I just remember that part of the interview because it like really affected me. I'm like, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. That shows up in the life review a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, kind of, I guess, sort of in closing, there's so much that we could probably delve into. Number one, we don't want to give everything away because
No, we want people to read it.
Read the book. I think that this is one of those where, it's just going to really get to people to understand that, we're all headed here. We're all going to pass at some point, like it or not. And some of us have done it already and have come back from it. So, I think it's more one of those informational things. If you get anything out of it, kind of like what you said, I mean, we're talking about people that have been through this amazing experience and have, this cathartic thing that they've had happen to them. And they're telling people, you especially, that, hey, don't be such a cheesehead. There's a lot of things happening where, at the end, it's going to matter. It's going to matter, and you need to realize that there's no need for some of this craziness. So,
Yeah, and thank you for putting all these together into a book, because I think collecting these and putting them in one source for people to just read, I think gets it out there much easier than, like you said, doing 800 podcasts. People may not get through all of those, but this kind of, brings it all together, and people can just read it, and they can reread it, and they can share it, and I think that's really great that you did
fantastic.
Yeah. I'm hoping it's kind of like a book that's full of really dramatic short stories, and you get drawn into them.
Yeah, absolutely they are. And I can speak to that because I would just be like, wow. And I'd have to pause after every one before I moved on to the next one and kind of just process it, because it's just massive.
Yep, for sure. So I guess really we're going to want to know where to tell our audience to go. So where can they find you? Where can they find this book? And kind of how do they sort of get involved in this?
Well, the book's going to be out on March 24th, although the Kindle can be pre-ordered now. And I've got a wide distribution, so it's not just on Amazon. I've done the paperback and the ebook, and the audiobooks all recorded. That's all uploaded. So that will be out March 24th, and it could be in Barnes & Noble and all sorts of places. Although if you go to Barnes & Noble, you probably have to order it. They wouldn't have it on the shelf. But my website is pastliveshypnosis.co.uk, and that's where I use this kind of central hub because it links through to the podcasts as well. And that's our Paranormal Afterlife and the Alien UFO podcast, which is, those two. And also, like we said, I'm past life regression hypnotherapist.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, thank you so much for coming by, and what an amazing gift you're giving to people. This is just, I think it's one of those that people need to, like I said, rationalize. It's on the table for us all, so why not read a little bit about it? Especially
if you're curious. Yeah. I mean, these NDE stories, everywhere are just fascinating stories.
Absolutely. Well, Simon, thanks again. Thank you so much, and we look forward to obviously having you back and anything else you put out there. By the way, I am a fan of the UFO podcast. I listen to that quite a bit. So
great.
Yeah, I'm a little bit of a ufologist at heart. But anyway, thank you so much, and look forward to talking to you soon.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.